now hand over the word to Professor Harris.
Thank you. I like to stand when I'm talking. I hope you can hear me without me lifting up this microphone. Is it on? Yes. I like to stand for many reasons. One is I like to stand near a door with my back to a wall, because I'll come to this in a moment, like Julian, I've made many enemies over the years by the things that I say. Let me start rather where Julian did. I think he and I are alike in very many ways. And perhaps start with a little bit of biography. First, we were alike in that we would both, I think, characterised ourselves as libertarian consequentialists. Although, as I shall argue, I think Julian has lost his libertarian credentials, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, we both married women who earn a lot more money than we do. I'm still married to the woman who earns a lot more money than me. She produces all of the best drama on British television, and my pride compels me to share with you that at the BAFTA Awards, which is the great English Television Awards, on this last Sunday night, she won her third BAFTA of her career for her programme Accused, and she's also won 4 Emmys and many other awards, which explains to you why she earns a lot more money than me. This is a great advantage, and I'm very pleased that we are still married. I'm acutely aware, like Julian, of our capacity to destroy the world. And I have been much influenced by my awareness of that capacity. The fact that humans have ceased to be an endangered species, but have become an endangering species, the endangering species, is something very close to my mind. From 1961, long before Julian was born, probably, I took part I was very closely involved in what then was known in the UK as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Like many people, I became impressed by the fact that nuclear weapons were a game-changing development, and that for the first time, humans not only had the capacity to destroy one another with unprecedented skill, but also the capacity to destroy this world in its entirety, and with it, possibly the only self-conscious species of beings in the universe. I took part in 3 Aldermaston marches. These were 3-day marches from the UK's Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at a place called Aldermaston, and they ended in London at huge rallies in Trafalgar Square between 1960 and 1964. These marches took place, and I took part in 3 of those, and a much forgotten High Wycombe March, which was also a 3-day march. So I was formed, if you like, by my political awareness of these dangers, and they remain with me. And indeed, my political activities at that time were one of the reasons I was thrown out of high school without ever having graduated, and why it took me a long time to find my way back into education and university many years after that. So they have been really formative events in my life. We also, I think, agree that women are more moral than men, and that it would not necessarily be a bad thing if men were more like women in that respect. And indeed, in my book, The Value of Life, in 1985, I described the possibility of an all-female world, a world in which men were allowed gradually to die out because they were so obnoxious, and I could not find moral arguments against it. So I think also my credentials on that front are reasonable. However, we don't agree about one very important thing. I don't agree, that freedom is the only value. It is just one value among many. I think it is a hugely important value. For me, freedom is at the heart of morality. It is not an optional extra. It's something that allows Julian, Peter Singer, to speak freely when many would silence them, and indeed me. It is a value of exceptional importance, and in the rest of what I want to say, I want to try and engage with what Julian and Ingmar have said most recently about freedom, and in particular two arguments, one of which at least Julian has produced this morning. So that's what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk. In their book Unfit for the Future, and subsequently in a paper called Moral Enhancement, Freedom and the God Machine, and you've heard a bit about the God Machine just now, Julian and Ingmar have outlined the arguments that I want to now engage with. Before turning to what I think is the horrific, quite horrific, and anti-libertarian God Machine, and I'll come on to that, I want to start with a small argument that is produced in the book Unfit for the Future. I'm giving you lots of plugs here, writing this, so I hope at least you appreciate that. This is what they say. Harris's core claim about freedom, expressed in the idiom of Milton's Paradise Lost, seems to be that sufficiency to stand is worthless, literally morally bankrupt, without freedom to fall. In other words, a decision to act in a way that is morally right is morally worthless, and I gloss this by saying, meaning presumably that you are not morally praiseworthy for it if you are not free to make the decision. Now, the presumption that Julian and Ingmar make here is, well, frankly, presumptuous, and I want to explain why. I'm talking about freedom, not about the state of the soul of an agent. What is important here is to be actually free. What is morally bankrupt is the illusion of freedom. Julian and Ingmar then produce an example that Harry Frankfurt must have thought of on a bad day, and I just want to remind you of what that example was. Here's how Julian and Ingmar set it out. Imagine that you decide to do the morally right thing on the basis of considering reasons for and against, as someone who is morally responsible is supposed to do. Imagine, however, that there is a freaky mechanism in your brain which would have kicked in if you had been in the process of making not this decision, but the decision to do something which is morally wrong. Hence, you are not free to fall. Would the presence of this freaky mechanism mean that you are not praiseworthy for making the right decision? It's hard to see why, they say. It would, after all, it's hard to see why it would have this difference. After all, the mechanism was never called into operation. It remained idle. In fact, you decided to do the morally right thing for precisely the same reasons as someone whose brain does not feature the freaky mechanism. Actions, the effects that are part of our moral decision-making. If the decision-making part of the process is separable from the action part of the process, then it is, as I claim, and continue to claim, morally inert. It is literally pointless from a moral perspective for what is a good state of mind worth if it makes no difference to the world. At best, Julian and Ingmar can say Harris's freedom to fall is not essential for moral choice. What they cannot say is that it is not essential for moral choice and action, because they have severed the action part from the choosing part. If you are imprisoned, and so is Frankfurt, which is why this remark is ridiculous, if you were imprisoned in a locked house in which you could never leave, but didn't know all the doors and windows were impassable, and as a matter of fact never formed the desire even to think of leaving, or to try to leave, would you have been free? The question is absurd, for if anything were wrong, we would certainly have heard. Once choice is divorced from action, it is quite literally, as I claim, morally bankrupt. And indeed, I don't think it's coherent to speak in this way for any practical purpose. That is why I say that Frankfurt must have had a bad day. And I'll come on to try and make that good in just a moment. This brings me to something that is implicit in Julian and Ingmar's book, and this is something that was possibly invented by Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State and Utopia, and then discussed much more fruitfully by Jonathan Glover in his book, What Sort of People Should There Be? And that is the experience machine. Nozick invented an experience machine in which people feel as if things are actually happening to them, but the reality is that they're not. It's just all done by brain simulation. Glover glosses this by imagining a dream world in which we can choose to experience, though not to actually live, a range of possible lives. And in a wide-ranging discussion, which I think is highly relevant to this, Glover sets limits to the idea of authenticity here. I've quoted from Glover's book. The dream world sets limits to the kinds of possible improvements over our ordinary world. A dream world, you'll recall it somewhere, you're plugged into the dream machine, and it makes you, gives you a life that you dream of. Whatever the life you dreamed of, that's what you think you are living, and it is indistinguishable from the real life. So you're successful, you're happy, you have all the money, the rich wives, or not, that you desire, and everything else. But of course, you're just sitting in a vat of liquid, and this appears to be the case. And Glover says, this can be seen, the fact that it sets limits to what we can actually do in the real world, by asking whether people in the dream world would be able to act in ways that harm each other, act in ways that actually influence what happens, act in ways that have moral consequences for others. If the answer is no, we are back with the drawbacks of behavior control, i.e. we're back in a situation of unfreedom. We have lost a large range of possible choices, and have correspondingly lost some of the role our choices play in creating our own characteristics. Being considerate, for instance, would no longer be a characteristic we could freely choose from among other possibilities. Now, Harry Frankfurt's freaky mechanism is, in Glover's words, a form of behavior control. It would, if it actually existed, have prevented anyone who possessed it from learning from moral mistakes, and so would have caused them to lose, and perhaps never even form, the capacity to do those sorts of things. They would not understand the role that choices make in the formation of their own personality. It is, I'm afraid, one of those absurd philosophers' examples, which in Wittgenstein's wonderful words are inert. Quote, a wheel that can be turned though nothing else moves with it is not part of the mechanism. Frankfurt's freaky non-part of the mechanism disconnects thought from action, and so changes the very nature of both, and hence the nature of what it means to have thoughts like that. This is why nothing can be learned from them. This disconnect is very important, and I'm now going to turn to a discussion of the God machine, which you've heard a little bit about just now. I think I've got a passage now in which I describe the God machine, but I think Julian's done that very well. But he and Ingmar insist that, and I quote, human beings with the God machine can still autonomously choose to be moral, since if they choose the moral action, the God machine will not intervene. Indeed, they are free to be moral. They are only unfree to do grossly immoral acts like killing or raping. End quote. Now this is Henry Ford's famous freedom to choose the colour, the colour of your Model T Ford. You can have any colour you like, so long as it's black. It's that sort of freedom. But it's also problematic in another way. What makes killing immoral? What makes sexual intercourse rape? These, it seems to me, are complex philosophical, ethical, legal, and social questions. They're not scientific questions, at least of the sort to which knowledge of brain states could conceivably reveal answers. The answers, whatever they are not to be found in states of the brain, nor even in intentions or motives of the agent, or indeed in pro-social attitudes. These are not totally irrelevant, but that is not where the answers are found. This is why I have consistently opposed the rather silly claims of some neuropsychologists that so-called pro-social attitudes are the stuff of which moral judgments are made. Wittgenstein, again, famously remarked, if God had looked into our mind, he would not have been able to see there of whom we were speaking. Why would God not have been able to see that? The answer is that of whom we were speaking is given by context. It is not given by states of the brain. It is given in the functioning of a form of life, as Wittgenstein would call it. And it seems to me that the answer is the same with morality. The answer to the question, is this murder or is this rape, are not there to be found in the brain. They are there to be found in the web of social life in which those actions have the meaning that they do. Think about feelings of grief. As an example, I used a lot when I used to teach aesthetics many years ago to art students. Somebody comes into my office one day and says, ashen-faced and looking absolutely terrible. And I say, what's the matter? And they say, oh, I'm absolutely grief-stricken. And I said, well, why? What's happened? Who's died? Who have you lost? What's happened? Oh, nobody's died. I've not lost anybody. I'm just subject to bouts of grief. Now, why, whatever they're feeling, it ain't grief. It's that grief is conceptually tied to things that happen in the world. They're not denying that they're feeling something, and I'm not denying that it's like the feeling that they might have had if they were feeling grief. But it ain't grief, because grief is the feeling you get when you've lost somebody important. That is why even God, looking into the brain, could not see whether the feeling was grief or not, because God would not have access to the facts, not from the brain state, from the facts in the world that make it grief. Now, the God machine might also be programmed, or take upon itself, the task of regulating self-harm. But again, consider a recent case. That's some of you may have read about it, the case of a Mexican woman who performed a cesarean section on herself, cutting open her stomach and delivering a baby. It was much in the news, you'll find it on Google. Or consider the amateur performing emergency surgery at the roadside to try to save a life. Or the man who attacked someone he believes to be a rapist, caught in flagrante delicto attacking his daughter. Might this father's intentions not seem murderous to the God machine? I think they would. Certainly, how would the God machine tell the difference? What would these intentions look like on the inside, seen from the outside by a God machine? Is this even a sensible question? I don't believe it. Hence my skepticism about much of the so-called work on pro-social or antisocial attitudes and its significance for moral judgment and moral enhancement, properly so-called. Also, my skepticism about the information to be gleaned from considering God machines is of the same sort. I could, of course, be wrong about all of this, but I'm skeptical about the claims made for moral enhancement and the picture of mind on which they depend. Now, I'm not against moral enhancement as a project. If it were possible, it would be a very good thing. So Gandhi famously was asked on coming to London in, I think, 1946, he'd been taken on this tour of all of the sites of London, having only lived previous to that in South Africa and India, and he was asked what he thought of Western civilization. And he replied, I think it would be a very good thing. I think moral enhancement would be a very good thing if it were possible. It's just that I don't think that the methods vaunted for it so far are at all promising. I don't rule out that there might be methods of moral enhancement. I'm not unique there. Julian was kind enough to say having a strong advocate for moral enhancement for many years. I think I've written 3 books on the subject. first of which, Wonder Woman and Superman in 1992, and the last, most recent of which, but not the last, I like another one, was Enhancing Evolution in 2007. I'm very open to enhancement of all sorts, but I'm skeptical about the value and indeed the methodologies that seem to be possible at the moment. I don't rule out that there may be better methodologies in the future. In ethics and law, as well as in biology and neurology, context is hugely important. And context is not accessible to the God machine, or indeed even to God, him or herself. Just to give one example of context, we're quite different area. Giuseppe Testa, an Italian philosopher and stem cell scientist, and I wrote in another context of a very different example. I'll just quote it to you. In the mid-1990s, scientists defined the genetic hierarchy underlying the development of the eye. The experiment was spectacular, and the very wording in which we still describe its outcome, genetic hierarchy, is a legacy of its seminal character. A single gene transplanted in tissues of the fly embryo, such as the wings and legs, was able to direct the formation of a whole eye, an ectopic eye. And yet, when the same fly gene was transferred into a mouse to check for its ability to rescue the eyeless mutation that resulted in eye absence, the result remained compelling. Again, an eye was formed, testifying to the remarkable evolutionary conservation of genes and development pathways. But this technical reenactment of Monod's aphorism, what is true for E. coli is true for the elephant, also showed that, as expected, a fly gene, when implanted in the mouse, formed a mouse eye. Context, in other words, is just as essential as genes. I think the same probably goes for the mind. Well, that's a speculation for which I can produce no evidence. But I want to come on to another aspect of the God machine. Julian and Marseille, and I quote, while people, they're talking about the good old days, while people weren't free to act immorally in the old days, since the law prohibited it on pain of punishment, the installment of the God machine means that it has become literally impossible to do these things. They imply this is a minor inconvenience at worst. But this, it seems to me, is a different level of unfreedom. As with all actions, when we are free, we are only free to do as we like and take the consequences. In the world of the God machine, even this is denied to us. Such freedom is literally impossible. In the old days, contra Julian and Ingmar, things were very different. Things are now, I think, still very different, thank God. Let's just remind ourselves what good old freedom under the law is actually like, and the sort of freedom most of us still enjoy. In a democratic state under the rule of law, there is genuine, I believe, non-trivial freedom. The government can be and is changed at set intervals. Democratic representatives are accountable to the law and to the people. The operation of the mechanisms of government and the law function in accordance with constitutionally established and protected consent of the government. The police and the courts can exercise discretion, I often do. Juries can acquit even those who are clearly guilty. And indeed, this has been a wonderful safety mechanism in the United Kingdom, where juries have consistently refused to convict people of murder when they have been involved in mercy killings, so-called mercy killings, killing somebody who was in terrible pain and suffering and who had helped them to end their life. Juries refuse to convict those people of murder. So there is a lot of latitude. Freedom can operate. The God machine, I doubt, would have the discretion or the wit or the compassion to exercise those sorts of judgments. When Julian and Ingmar say the God machine means that it has become literally impossible to do evil, and imply this is a minor change from the old days when the law prohibited things on pain of punishment, this seems to me to be some way from reality. And it gets worse. Talking of the human agent
in circumstances in which the God machine operated, they say it seems to her, that is the human agent, that she has changed her mind spontaneously. She experiences a life of complete freedom, though she is not free. In other words, she was allowed to do something wicked, the God machine changes her mind, she doesn't do the wicked thing, but she experiences that as her changing her own mind. Denied even the ability to know when our freedom is being curtailed, we would lack the motive to rebel. And lacking a constitutional and democratic framework for control of the God machine, we would have no recourse whatsoever. And it gets even worse than that. Again, I quote, "It is perhaps this kind of world which objectors to moral enhancement like Harris fear. Human beings are no longer free to fall, or at least not free to fall big time. But it might be wondered what is so bad about such a world after all. Those who value and want to be free can be free, or at least as free as humans can ever be. And everyone is much better off for the absence of evil. There is no physical incarceration or great harm wrought by one human being on another. Why not, they ask, create the God machine as a fail-safe device which kicks in when moral enhancement has not been effective?" And as you've heard from Julian, the answer they give to that question is, why not indeed? Do I ask myself, why not create a God machine? You betcha I do. And I answer in the negative. And I do not for a moment think that everyone is much better off for the absence of evil in that sort of context. The evil would be the God machine itself, 1,000,000 times worse than Milton's God, whom I imagined. And how would it be fail-safe? Sed quis custodiet ipsos custodes, but who guards the guardians? How would the operations of the God machine, this new megalomaniac, be challenged, reviewed, or even known about? Julian and Ingmar believe that there is, and I quote from them, one way in which the God machine would not compromise autonomy. Julian's mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. Autonomy is the power to make well-grounded, rational decisions and to act in accordance with them. There is one way in which the God machine would not compromise autonomy. That is, even if it did prevent people from acting immorally. This would be the case if people voluntarily chose to be connected. Voluntary connection to the God machine would then be an example of a pre-commitment contract. The paradigm example of which is Ulysses and the Sirens. And Julian didn't go into the detail of Homer's example, but just to remind you, Ulysses, sailing on his boat with his crew, wanted to pass the island of the Sirens, whose song no one could hear without becoming enslaved to them. And he asked his men to tie him to the mast so that he could hear the song, and then he stuffed his men's ears with wax and said, "You ignore the Sirens, sail on, and ignore me when I cry for you to release me." Now, how they would have actually heard him crying to be released, having stuffed their ears with wax to such an extent they couldn't hear the Sirens, is an interesting problem, but Homer, being a poet, ignores those sorts of minor details. But this is a poor example, and no analogy for the God machine. Ulysses orders his men to bind him to the mast temporarily and for a particular purpose. His imprisonment has a brief and finite duration, and as Julian rightly says, is fully voluntary. But it's like agreeing to be sedated for a surgical operation, in which one loses the power to say, "Stop cutting," to the surgeon. But it's brief, and you know the limits. The proper analogy with the God machine is selling yourself into slavery, or giving yourself into slavery, a condition which is open-ended and potentially endless. The rule of the God machine is literally the rule of a slave-owning tyrant, which, as Julian and Ingmar admit with magisterial understatement, does compromise autonomy. Now, the freedom to sell yourself into slavery has been much debated by libertarians over the years, but I think with few exceptions it's fair to say that it is admitted to be, and I myself believe this to be true, one of the exercises of liberty incompatible with the very liberty of which it is claimed to be an exercise. Julian and Ingmar have found another. They say, and I quote, "If there is anything wrong with the God machine, it seems that at most it is wrong to connect competent adults against their will." But they go on to deny that even this is problematic. Freedom, they say, is only one value. The value of human well-being and respect for the most basic rights outweighs the value of autonomy. Well, this is a point of view, albeit not mine. And it may in the end come down to a clash of values. I don't think there is a knockdown argument here, one way or the other. We're sort of describing different sorts of worlds and inviting you, the democratic citizens, to decide which is the more attractive world and what are you going to vote for. What I think there is clear is that Savulescu's and Person's repeated claims in so many places since I wrote my paper on moral enhancement and freedom quite a few years ago now, that moral enhancement as they see it is not inimical to freedom, are hollow. Moreover, my claims that both the ways in which moral enhancement is most likely for the foreseeable future to function are indeed inimical to freedom, and that at least some of their advocates, like Julian and Ingmar, are indeed also inimical to freedom in the ways that we've explored. Some version of the God machine is, as Savulescu and Person now admit, what they hope moral enhancement will prove to be. And tragically, in my view, they think this is not controversial, and that's a quote. This is not controversial. As Mill wrote, quote, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant, end quote. And so one more part of that quote, what more moral way, they say, to prevent harm to others is there than to cause a person to change his mind, which is what they claim the God machine would do. I think this is inconsistent, to say the least. They've admitted that it will only appear to the agent that he or she has changed his mind. The God machine would have changed it for them, make no mistake. They won't have changed their mind. They will only, like those in the dream machine or in the experience machine of Robert Nozick, it will only seem to them that this is what has happened. It won't be what has happened. They will think they are in control, but they will not be in control. More important by far, Mill, when he talks of the exercise of power over others, is talking about legitimate power exercised through law or peer pressure, both of which leave the agent ultimately free to disagree and disobey. In extreme cases, it is true, Mill would also include harm used in self-defense or violence against assailants to prevent harm to third parties. But Mill imagines that the justifications for the exercise of this power will be revealed, will be obvious, by consideration of the merits of the case. As I've consistently argued, merits that are accessible to reason, all things considered. Once you have a mechanism which bypasses reason, all things considered, there are no checks and balances. The God machine, if it knows what's good for it, and by God it would know what was good for it, would never allow itself to be switched off or disconnected. And it would justify the decision to itself, following Savulescu in Person, as being in humanity's own best interests. It's selling yourselves into slavery, and the same is true of chemical forms of the God machine, which Julian and Ingmar believe have to be universally applied and exceptionless precisely because of the acute danger in which they believe, rightly in my view, the danger's there, I'm not belittling the danger, in which they believe we all stand of complete self-destruction through the increased powers of science and technology. This is why we have constantly, in a way, misunderstood one another over these debates, because in their first papers on this, they make it very clear that the big danger is the danger foreseen by Martin Rees in his book Our Final Century, that only one evil person is sufficient to destroy the world. And what we have to do, in their view, is take steps against the possibility that that one person, be he or she evil or be he or she the village idiot, as Martin Rees eloquently described it, that one person might be enough. And so ideally what we should do, in their view, is develop methods of moral control through moral so-called enhancement, ideally genetic or chemical, that could be applied universally and therefore would rule out this 1 in a however many billion the world population is chance that an evil monster or a village idiot would screw it all up for the rest of us. I think we have to guard against that danger another way. I think that doing it their way, even in the ideal world of the God machine, or the equally ideal world of further perfected molecules like oxytocin and serotonin and others, which might be universally applied, or indeed by genetic manipulation, such as, for example, feminizing the entire human population, those things would not be enough. The danger would still be there. It wouldn't do the trick. And so the pressure would be on and on and on always for something that would be universal and exceptionless, like the God machine, which would annihilate freedom. Now, for me, freedom is, and this is just perhaps a psychological difference between Julian Umar and me, and I don't think there's a philosophical way of resolving that difference. Freedom matters more to me. I don't think freedom is just one of the values. I think it is, if you like, the constituent value, the value from which our ability to form values flows. Deny us the ability to form values in the way that we've traditionally done, by making mistakes and learning from them, goes to the heart of the sort of creatures that we want to be. Hence the wonderful title of Jonathan Glover's book, What Sort of People Should There Be? That, I think, is the question. And I would prefer to take a punt, a chance, on creatures like us surviving with our freedom than to ensure our survival through the removal of freedom. As I say, this is possibly a temperamental difference rather than a philosophical difference, but it's one I feel keenly. And that is at the heart of my objections so far to the forms of moral enhancement. I think we do have methods of moral enhancement, and they're not bad. I believe I believe in moral improvement, believe in the sense that I think it has happened, and I think there's evidence that it's happened and continues to happen. I think we are better societies than we used to be. More people are free, more people have reasonable standards of living, more people are out of poverty than formerly. Diseases have been eradicated, diseases that used to kill millions every year, diseases like smallpox and polio. It's not all good. Science makes lots of mistakes. But I prefer to take a punt on our improvement in that way. And I invite you, and this I think is all one can do in these arguments, to think that my picture of a world with risk, but with freedom, is more attractive than a world in which risk has been abolished, but with it, freedom. At least I want to live long enough to go on experiencing the world that we've got. Thank you.